Her fingers, once alive with the fire of Rachmaninoff, now moved with a different kind of practiced grace. They were a cleaner's hands, calloused and chapped from years of chemical solutions and rough cloths, yet they danced over the ivory keys with a tenderness that defied their appearance. Beside her, a small boy, no older than 9, sat with his back ramrod straight, a stark white blindfold wrapped gently over his eyes. His own small hands, soft and unmarked by hardship, were cradled beneath hers. He was not just playing the notes, he was breathing them. A melody, a Chopin nocturne that spoke of moonlight and forgotten sorrows, flowed from the grand piano filling the cavernous penthouse music room. It was a sound too pure, too profound for a space decorated with calculated opulence. The boy, Leo, had a smile on his face, a radiant, uninhibited expression of pure joy, as if the music were painting a world of vibrant color directly onto his mind. The woman, Isabella, had tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She wasn't just teaching him a song. She was excavating a part of her own soul she had buried 6 feet deep years ago, alongside her mother. This was their secret world, a fragile sanctuary built between the deep indigo of a Chicago night and the sterile hum of a skyscraper's ventilation system. A place where a maid and a billionaire's son were not defined by their stations, but by the shared language of a heartbreakingly beautiful melody. If you've ever felt a connection so powerful it seemed to bend reality around it, a bond that transcends words and logic, then you understand the sacredness of this moment. Let us know you're here with us by leaving a like, because it's through these shared human experiences that we find the most powerful stories. But this sanctuary of sound, suspended high above the glittering, indifferent city, was not a beginning. It was the epicenter of a tremor that had started weeks ago in 2 separate lives, separated by an almost unimaginable gulf of wealth, status, and experience. To understand how Isabella Ramirez, a single mother who measured her life in bus schedules and discounted groceries, and Leo Thorne, a boy who had everything except what he truly needed, found each other in the quiet solitude of a Tuesday night, we have to go back. Back to the cold, biting wind whipping off Lake Michigan, to the moment Isabella's shift began. Her world was a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, a neighborhood vibrant with murals and the smell of fresh pan dulce, a place where the towering silhouette of downtown Chicago was a distant, shimmering promise that belonged to other people. That evening, her 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, a whirlwind of bright pink ribbons and endless questions, had wrapped her small arms tightly around Isabella's legs. "Don't go, Mummy," she'd whispered into the worn fabric of Isabella's uniform trousers. Isabella had knelt, her knees protesting, and smoothed Sophia's dark hair back from her face. "I have to, mi amor, so we can have our little house, and your drawing pencils and Saturday pancakes." She kissed Sophia's forehead, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her daughter, a scent that was her only true north. She left her with Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, an elderly woman whose kindness was a small, steady light in their often unpredictable life. The bus ride downtown was a journey between universes, as the colorful, close-knit buildings of her neighborhood gave way to the cold steel and impersonal glass of the Loop. Isabella felt a familiar transformation. She became smaller, more invisible. She was no longer Mommy, the center of Sophia's world. She was part of the night crew, a ghost in a machine that catered to the city's elite. Her hands, as she pulled on her latex gloves in the sterile service basement of the Thorne Tower, a building that pierced the clouds like a shard of obsidian, ached with a phantom memory. She could almost feel the smooth, weighted resistance of piano keys under her fingertips. Before the grief, before the hospital bills had piled up like impassable snowdrifts, before her mother's final, rattling breath had stolen the music from the air, these hands had been her gift. They had flown across the keyboard of the old, perpetually out-of-tune upright piano that had dominated their small living room, filling their home with a life and a passion that defied their poverty. Her mother, a woman with a laugh that could make flowers bloom, would sit and listen for hours, her eyes closed, a proud smile on her face. "You have a symphony in your soul, Isabella," she would say. But when she died, the symphony died with her. The piano was sold for a fraction of its worth to help pay for a funeral she couldn't truly afford. The music became a source of unbearable pain, a reminder of everything she had lost. So she silenced it. She traded sheet music for shift work, melodies for the mundane rhythm of wiping, scrubbing, and polishing the lives of people she would never meet. On the 27th floor of that same tower, in a penthouse that was less a home and more a curated museum of modern wealth, another kind of silence reigned. It was a heavy, sterile silence, broken only by the faint, disembodied voice of Elias Thorne, who stood silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's-eye view of the city. He was on the phone, as always, his voice a low, commanding baritone, as he negotiated the terms of a multi-billion-dollar merger. He was a master of his universe, a man who could bend markets and crush competitors with a single decisive command. He saw the world as a series of problems to be solved, of assets to be acquired. He was brilliant, powerful, and utterly, profoundly absent from the life of his own son. In the music room, a space dominated by a gleaming black Steinway grand piano that was worth more than Isabella's apartment building, 9-year-old Leo Thorne was lost. A rare genetic condition had stolen his sight shortly after birth, leaving him to navigate a world of shapes and shadows through sound and touch. The piano, his father had reasoned, would be a perfect outlet, a structured, logical way for him to engage with the world. He'd hired the best tutors, the most renowned therapists, but none of them had been able to breach the wall of the boy's quiet isolation. Leo sat at the magnificent instrument, the customary white blindfold over his eyes, not because he needed it to block out light, but because it had become a calming ritual, a way to shut out the overwhelming nothingness and focus only on the feel of the keys beneath his fingers. He tried to play. A single, hesitant note, then another. The sound that emerged was fragmented, a disjointed series of melancholic plinks that echoed the boy's own fractured loneliness. He knew the notes in his head, could feel the shape of the melody he wanted to create, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The frustration mounted in his small chest, a silent, helpless scream against the suffocating perfection of his gilded cage. His father, in the next room, finished his call, made another, and never once noticed the sound of his son's heart breaking, one dissonant chord at a time. Isabella's cart glided almost silently over the polished marble floors of the 27th floor hallway. This was the quietest part of her shift. The residents were either out for the night or secluded within their vast apartments. Her job was to erase any trace of human presence, a fingerprint on a brass handle, a scuff mark on the floor, a speck of dust on a mahogany console table. She was a curator of invisibility. As she worked her way down the hall, a sound, faint at first, reached her. It was the sound of a piano, but it was wrong. The notes were hesitant, clumsy, full of a deep, aching sadness that resonated with the hollow space in her own chest. She paused, her cleaning cloth held mid-air. The music, if it could be called that, was coming from the Thorne penthouse. She knew the family only by name and reputation, the powerful CEO, the blind son. She found herself drawn toward the door, an invisible string pulling her forward. The melody faltered, stopped, then started again. The same fumbling passage repeated with growing frustration. Every discordant note was a hammer blow against the wall she had built around her heart. She knew that struggle. She knew the desperate, clawing need to make the music in your soul match the sound coming from your hands. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in almost a decade. Her training, her every instinct for self-preservation, screamed at her to walk away. This was not her concern. Crossing this threshold was a violation, a risk that could cost her the job that kept a roof over her daughter's head. She was a cleaner. Her purpose here was to be unseen, unheard. But the music was a plea, a cry for help in a language only she seemed to understand. She thought of Sophia, safe and asleep in her bed. Then she thought of this boy, alone in a room the size of her entire apartment, wrestling with a beautiful instrument that was giving him nothing but pain. The conflict inside her was a physical thing, a tightening in her throat, a frantic beating in her chest. She looked down at her own hands, at the calloused skin and the faint, silvery scars from a broken glass she'd cleaned up last week. They were not a musician's hands anymore, or were they? With a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, she made a decision. It wasn't logical, it wasn't safe, but it felt more right than anything she had done in years. She rested her cleaning supplies silently against the wall and pushed the heavy oak door. It swung inward without a sound. There he was, a small solitary figure dwarfed by the magnificent piano, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He began the passage again, his small fingers stumbling over the keys. Isabella moved across the plush carpet, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She reached the piano bench and, with a grace she thought she had forgotten, sat down beside him. Leo, startled at the sudden proximity of another person, his hands freezing over the keys. He didn't say a word, just tilted his head, listening. Isabella didn't speak either. Words would have broken the fragile spell of the moment. Instead, she lifted her hands, the hands of a cleaner, and gently placed them over his. His fingers were small and tense beneath hers. She felt the tremor of his frustration. She took a slow, calming breath, and then together they began to play. She guided him, her touch firm but gentle, correcting his fingering, shaping the rhythm, transforming the fragmented, sorrowful notes into a fluid, tender melody. For the first time in years, the symphony in Isabella's soul began to stir, its music flowing not from a place of grief, but from a profound, unexpected connection to the lonely boy beside her. The silence of the 27th floor was a living thing, a pressurized quiet that felt different from the weary hush of her own apartment building. The next night, Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm as chaotic as Leo's first attempts at a melody. Every footstep of her rubber-soled shoes seemed to echo down the marble hallway, a drumbeat announcing her transgression. Cleaning the mahogany console table outside the music room, she worked on autopilot, her mind a battlefield. One part of her, the pragmatic single mother, screamed that she was risking everything: her job, Sophia's stability, the fragile roof over their heads, for a foolish, sentimental impulse. But another voice, a quieter, deeper one she hadn't heard in years, whispered of the sublime rightness of what she had done. It was the voice of the girl who had once spent 8 hours a day lost in Bach and Debussy, the girl whose world had been shattered by a single phone call from a hospital. She finished her assigned tasks, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the last surface. The pull was magnetic, an invisible string tied to her soul, leading her back to that door. Hesitating for only a moment that felt like an eternity, she pushed it open. The room was just as she had left it, bathed in the soft ambient glow of the Chicago skyline. And there he was, a small silhouette against the vast window, sitting on the edge of the piano bench, his white blindfold in place. He wasn't playing, just running his fingers lightly over the keys, a silent question in the gesture. He must have heard the faint click of the latch, because his head tilted in her direction. "Is that you?" His voice was small, hopeful. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "It's me, Leo. It's Isabella." A smile, tentative at first, then blossoming into pure, unadulterated relief, spread across his face. "I hoped you would come back." That simple admission dismantled the last of her defenses. She walked over and sat beside him, the scent of lemon polish from her hands mingling with the aged wood of the piano. This time, it felt less like an intrusion and more like a homecoming. "I couldn't stay away," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The music, it called me back." And so their secret ritual began. Each night, after completing her duties on the floor, Isabella would slip into the music room for 1 stolen hour. It became the axis around which her entire day revolved. She didn't teach him from books, or with the rigid methodology of the tutors his father hired. She taught him with her hands and her heart. She would place his small fingers on the keys and her own over them, letting him feel the pressure, the flow, the release. She taught him not scales, but colors. "This chord," she would say, playing a soft C major 7th. "This feels like the first warm day of spring after a long winter. Can you feel the sunshine in it?" Leo would concentrate, his brow furrowed, and then slowly nod. "It's yellow," he'd say with certainty, "and a little bit of blue." She taught him rhythm through breath. Music has to breathe just like we do, she explained, her hands guiding his through a simple nocturne. Feel that pause? That's the piano taking a breath before it speaks again. He began to understand phrasing not as a technical requirement, but as the soul of a piece, the thing that turned a collection of notes into a story. He learned that staccato notes were like raindrops on a window pane, and a long flowing legato was like smoothing a silk sheet over a bed. His world, once defined by the textures he could touch and the sounds he could identify, began to explode into a symphony of emotion. For Isabella, these hours were a painful, beautiful excavation of her former self. Each melody they played together was a ghost from her past, a memory of her mother sitting beside her, humming along. For years, the piano had been a monument to her grief, its keys a silent accusation of the life she had abandoned. Now, through Leo's small, eager hands, it was being resurrected. The calluses on her fingers, earned from harsh chemicals and endless scrubbing, softened as they found their old grace on the ivory. She was no longer just a cleaner, a single mother struggling to make ends meet. In this room, under the silent gaze of the city, she was a musician. She was an artist. She was herself again. The tears that sometimes fell as they played were no longer just for what she had lost, but for what she was finding again. Leo's progress was astonishing. The disjointed, frustrated sounds that once filled the penthouse were replaced by coherent, increasingly beautiful melodies. His mood, which his father had long attributed to a kind of quiet melancholy, transformed. The staff noticed he was smiling more. He spoke more during his meals. He seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his small shoulders. One evening, Elias Thorne was on a video call in his home office, negotiating a multi-million-dollar merger with a firm in Tokyo. In the background, the faint, clear notes of a Chopin waltz drifted in. It was played with a surprising sensitivity, a delicate touch that he had never heard from his son. "What is that music, Elias?" the executive on the screen asked, a smile on his face. "Your son has a remarkable talent." Elias felt a swell of unfamiliar pride. "Yes," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "He's been working with a new therapist, Dr. Sharma. Very expensive, but it seems she's finally getting results." He made a mental note to authorize a bonus for the doctor, a woman Leo had met only twice and thoroughly disliked. Elias ended the call, allowing himself a brief, self-satisfied smile. His system worked. He identified a problem, threw money and the best resources at it, and it was solved. He didn't need to understand the mechanics of it, only the outcome. He walked past the music room without a glance, his mind already moving on to the next deal, the next conquest, completely oblivious to the quiet miracle unfolding just a few feet away. But the systems of the Thorne Tower were designed to notice everything. Down in the pristine, sterile white security hub in the building's sub-basement, Samuel Jenkins was conducting his nightly review of the surveillance feeds. Samuel was a man for whom the world made sense only when it was contained within a framework of rules and protocols. He was 47, unmarried, and his job was the singular defining passion of his life. He saw himself not as a guard, but as a guardian of order in a world of chaos. His eyes, accustomed to scanning dozens of screens for the slightest anomaly, were sharp and unforgiving. And for the past 3 weeks, he had been tracking an anomaly. Cleaner 347, Isabella Ramirez. He first noticed it as a minor deviation, her cleaning cart left unattended in the 27th floor corridor for 58 minutes, well over the allotted time. An inefficiency. He logged it. Then he noticed the pattern. Every Tuesday through Saturday at approximately 10:15 in the evening, her GPS-tagged cart would stop outside Penthouse B. She would then disappear from the corridor cameras. She wouldn't reappear for almost a full hour. Tonight, his suspicion had curdled into certainty. He isolated the cameras in the corridor, zooming in with a crisp digital precision. He watched Isabella wipe down the console table, her movements efficient and practiced. He saw her pause, look both ways down the empty hall, and then slip through the door of the Thorne penthouse. A door she had no authorization to enter outside of her scheduled, supervised cleaning times. Samuel's lips thinned into a hard line. This was a severe breach. The Thorne residence was the highest level of security. He rewound the footage from previous nights, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The pattern was undeniable. He began compiling a new file on his desktop, labeling it Breach Protocol 347 Ramirez. He opened a digital log and began to type, his words precise and devoid of emotion. 22:14. Subject 347, I. Ramirez, deviates from approved cleaning route. 22:15. Subject utilizes unauthorized access to penthouse B residence of CEO Elias Thorne. Purpose, unknown. Duration of unauthorized entry, 59 minutes. This marks the 14th documented instance of this breach in 21 days. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his glasses. He wasn't motivated by malice. He didn't know Isabella Ramirez and he didn't care to. He was motivated by the sanctity of the rules. She was a variable he couldn't account for, a crack in the perfect ordered fortress he was paid to protect. What was she doing in there? Was she stealing, spying for a corporate rival, fraternizing with the resident, a direct violation of Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Employee Handbook? The possibilities were all dangerous, all violations that required action. He pulled up the schematics for Penthouse B. The music room was in a wing without internal cameras, a privacy concession Mr. Thorne had demanded. The lack of visual evidence was frustrating, but the circumstantial case was overwhelming. He had timestamps, GPS tracking from her cart, and corridor footage. It was more than enough. He felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He would continue to monitor and document for one more week, building an airtight case. Then he would submit his report directly to Ms. Evelyn Reed in Human Resources. Ms. Reed was a woman who, like him, understood and appreciated the beautiful, unwavering clarity of rules. Upstairs, in the soundproofed music room, Isabella and Leo were lost in their own world, blissfully unaware of the invisible net closing around them. Isabella had just shown him a simple, haunting melody from a lullaby her mother used to sing. Leo played it back to her, his touch infused with a pure, intuitive sadness that made her heart ache. "It sounds like missing someone," he whispered, his fingers still resting on the keys. Isabella nodded, a tear tracing a silent path down her cheek. "It does," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But it also sounds like remembering them, and that's a beautiful thing, isn't it?" Leo reached out, his small hand finding hers on the bench. He squeezed it gently, a simple gesture of comfort that felt more profound than any words. In that moment, the risk, the fear, the outside world, it all melted away, leaving only the two of them and the music that bound them together. But in the silent, humming server rooms far below, their stolen moments were already being logged, time-stamped and compiled into a formal complaint, a sterile document that would threaten to shatter their fragile, harmonious sanctuary. Samuel Jenkins clicked Save and began the report that would change all of their lives. The digital memorandum landed with the sterile finality of a closing steel door. It was authored by Samuel Jenkins, third shift security lead, and it detailed with meticulous, passionless precision 6 separate instances of unauthorized entry into the Thorne penthouse by custodial staff member Isabella Ramirez. Time-stamped security footage stills were attached, grainy black and white images that stripped the music room of all its warmth, rendering Isabella a shadowy intruder and Leo a silent accomplice. The report cited violations of Sections 4, 7, and 11 of the building's Residential Employee Conduct Code, fraternization with a resident, misuse of company time, and occupying a private space without explicit authorization. It was a document devoid of context, a clinical execution of protocol that was now making its way up the corporate food chain, a slow-moving, unstoppable serpent of bureaucracy. 2 days later, the summons came. It wasn't a formal letter, but a crisp, impersonal message on the small tablet she used to clock in and out. "Ms. Ramirez, please report to the office of Evelyn Reed, Human Resources, on the 42nd floor at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Your presence is mandatory." The name Evelyn Reed was one Isabella had only ever heard in hushed, anxious tones from other employees, a name synonymous with terminations and clinical, unsentimental efficiency. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach, a familiar, unwelcome guest, all day, As she scrubbed floors and polished brass fixtures in the lower levels of the building, the message replayed in her mind. 42nd floor, mandatory. She thought of Sophia's upcoming dental appointment, the rent check that was due next week, the ever-present, precarious balance of their lives resting on the meager foundation of this job. But more than that, she thought of Leo. She thought of the way his fingers had finally learned to curve just so over the keys, the way a small, triumphant smile would bloom on his face when he mastered a difficult passage, the way the music had become their own secret language, a sacred space where a blind boy could see and a broken woman could feel whole again. The next morning, the elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like a slow, inexorable ascent to a scaffold. The doors slid open to a world of muted greys, brushed steel, and frosted glass. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and ambition. In the reception area, a woman with a perfectly placid face directed her to a seat without looking up from her monitor. Isabella sat on the edge of a sleek leather chair that felt colder and more unforgiving than any park bench. She smoothed down her simple, clean uniform, acutely aware of how out of place she was in this high-altitude temple of corporate order. Mr. Victor Alvarez, her direct supervisor, emerged from a hallway. He was a man perpetually caught between the demands of his superiors and the realities of his staff, and the conflict had etched permanent lines of anxiety around his eyes. He gave her a weak, pitying smile. "Isabella, thanks for coming. They're ready for you." He gestured toward a glass-walled conference room, and she felt like a patient being led to a room to receive a terminal diagnosis. Inside, the room was dominated by a long, dark wood table, polished to a mirror shine. At its head sat Ms. Evelyn Reed. She was a woman in her late 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, her eyes scanning a tablet with an unnerving focus. She did not look up when Isabella entered. Mr. Alvarez took a seat to Ms. Reed's right, looking deeply uncomfortable. Isabella was directed to the solitary chair at the far end of the table, a deliberate and effective piece of psychological staging that made her feel miles away, isolated, and insignificant. "Ms. Ramirez," Ms. Reed began, her voice as crisp and devoid of warmth as the room itself. She finally lifted her eyes, and they were like chips of granite. "We have a serious matter to discuss. It has been brought to our attention with substantial evidence that you have been in violation of several key company policies." She swiped a finger across her tablet, and a large monitor on the wall flickered to life, displaying one of the grainy security stills. It showed Isabella sitting at the piano next to Leo. "Can you confirm that this is you?" Isabella's throat was dry. She could only nod. "And can you confirm that you were in Mr. Thorne's private residence outside the scope of your designated cleaning duties, without authorization from either Mr. Thorne or your supervisor?" "Yes, but—" Ms. Reed held up a perfectly manicured hand, cutting her off. "A simple yes or no will suffice for the record. Ms. Ramirez," she continued, her tone remaining flat, prosecutorial. "The report filed by building security details at least 6 such incursions over the past 3 weeks. It alleges that you have been engaging in unauthorized and inappropriate fraternization with a minor resident, the son of our CEO, Mr. Elias Thorne." The word inappropriate landed like a physical blow. It was vile, a clinical term that twisted something beautiful and pure into something ugly and transactional. Mr. Alvarez shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Isabella," he said, his voice softer, trying to mediate. "You understand the rules. We have them for a reason. For the privacy and security of our residents, for your own protection." "This isn't about protection," Ms. Reed interjected coolly, her gaze fixed on Isabella. "This is about a severe breach of professional conduct. You are a member of the custodial staff. Your role has clear boundaries. What you have done is not only a fireable offense, it opens this company up to significant liability. We cannot have employees developing personal relationships with residents, particularly with their children. It raises questions of motive, of potential exploitation." Isabella felt a surge of heat rise in her chest, a righteous anger that burned away the cold fear. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer timid. It was low and steady, imbued with a conviction that startled both of them. Exploitation. Motive. My motive was a little boy sitting alone in a dark room, trying to make something beautiful and only making noise. My motive was seeing a sadness in him that I recognized. Ms. Reed's expression remained unchanged, a carefully constructed wall of indifference. Your personal feelings are irrelevant to corporate policy, Ms. Ramirez. They shouldn't be, Isabella shot back, her voice gaining strength. She looked past Ms. Reed, toward Mr. Alvarez, hoping to find a flicker of understanding. Do you know what it's like to have music inside you, a whole world of color and feeling, and have no way to let it out? That was Leo. He wasn't just hitting the keys. He was trying to speak. I helped him find the words. She looked back at Ms. Reed, her gaze unwavering. I taught him how to play. I taught him how to feel the music, not just hear it. And I did it because nobody else was. I did it because it was the right thing to do. It had nothing to do with my job, or his father, or this building. For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Ms. Reed's face. You are not a therapist. You are not a music teacher. You are a cleaner. You wildly overstepped your bounds. Your actions have put this company and yourself in a compromised position. As of this moment, you are on official suspension pending termination. Termination. The word hung in the sterile air, a final, heavy sentence. It meant no more income. It meant packing boxes and telling Sophia they had to leave their home. It meant failure. She saw Sophia's face in her mind, trusting and innocent, and the anger inside her gave way to a wave of crushing despair. But beneath the despair, there was a strange, quiet resolve. She had known the risk every single time she had pushed that music room door open, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she would do it all again. I understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pushed her chair back and stood up, her dignity a fragile shield around her. I did what I did for Leo, and I am not sorry for it. She turned and walked out of the cold glass room, leaving Ms. Reed and Mr. Alvarez sitting in a stunned, uncomfortable silence. That evening, Isabella worked her final shift in a daze. The familiar routine of wiping counters and emptying trash bins felt dreamlike, disconnected. Every gleaming surface reflected her own haunted face. She was supposed to clear out her locker, turn in her access card, and disappear. But she couldn't. She couldn't leave without saying goodbye. She knew it was reckless, a final act of defiance that could only make things worse. But the thought of Leo sitting at that piano tomorrow night, waiting for a lesson that would never come, was unbearable. He wouldn't understand. He would just feel the silence, the renewed loneliness. One last time, she told herself, just one last song. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Elias Thorne was stepping off his corporate jet at a private Chicago airfield. The trip had been a brutal success, a hostile takeover finalized after 3 days of relentless 17-hour negotiations. He was exhausted, his mind a tangled knot of contractual clauses and market projections. All he wanted was a glass of scotch and the silent solitude of his penthouse. He rode in the back of his town car, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and silver. His phone buzzing with congratulatory messages he had no energy to answer. He felt the familiar emptiness that always followed a victory, the hollow echo of a success that had no one to share it with. When he arrived at the building, he bypassed the main lobby, taking his private elevator directly to the penthouse. The apartment was dark and silent, just as he'd expected. He loosened his tie, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. He was heading for the bar when he heard it. It was faint at first, a delicate thread of sound weaving through the silence. It was the piano, but it wasn't Leo's usual halting, hesitant playing. This was different. This was music. It was a Chopin nocturne, a piece so full of exquisite sorrow and breathtaking beauty that it seemed to hang in the air like moonlit smoke. It was played with a grace and emotional depth that was utterly foreign to this house. He stopped dead in the hallway, his fatigue vanishing, replaced by a profound and unsettling curiosity. He set his briefcase down silently. Who was playing? The new therapist he'd hired. She wasn't scheduled until Thursday. He moved quietly down the hall, drawn toward the sound as if by an invisible current. The music grew richer, more enveloping with each step, a cascade of impossibly perfect notes, filled with a longing that resonated deep in his own chest, touching a part of him that had been dormant for years. He reached the music room door, which was ajar by just a few inches. The warm golden light spilled out into the dark hallway. He paused, his hand hovering over the cool brass doorknob, listening to the final, heartbreakingly beautiful chords fade into a resonant silence. Then a small, clear voice, filled with an unrestrained joy he hadn't heard in years. "We did it, Isabella. That was the best we've ever played it." Isabella. The name registered with a jolt of disbelief. His son's voice, the maid's name, it made no sense. He moved closer, pressing his eye to the narrow gap in the doorway, his world about to be irrevocably fractured. He saw them. He saw the maid Isabella sitting on the piano bench, her eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, her face illuminated by a look of transcendent cathartic release. And beside her, he saw his son, Leo, his small frame leaning against her, a radiant, unfiltered smile of pure happiness on his face. He saw Isabella's hands, the hands he'd only ever seen holding a dustcloth, resting gently on Leo's shoulders. In that instant, the breathtaking music, his son's impossible joy, and the identity of the woman responsible for both, crashed together in his mind with the force of a tectonic collision, shaking the very foundations of his carefully ordered universe. The world, which had been a flowing river of sound and harmony, shattered into 1,000 silent, jagged pieces. The final, resonant chord of the nocturne hung in the air, a ghost of a perfect moment, before the click of the heavy oak door latch cut through it like a guillotine. Elias Thorne stepped into the room. He didn't stride in with the authority of a chief executive officer. He entered with the hesitant, heavy-footed gait of a man trespassing in his own home. The air, once warm with shared music, instantly turned sharp and cold. Isabella shot to her feet, her hands flying back from the piano keys as if they had been burned. The warmth drained from her face, replaced by a pale mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Every nightmare she had harbored in the quiet hours of her shift coalesced into this single heart-stopping moment. Her job, her livelihood, the fragile stability she had built for Sophia. She could feel it all crumbling to dust under the weight of his gaze. Leo, however, was still floating in the music's afterglow. His blindfold, a soft strip of white silk, made him an island of blissful ignorance in a sea of sudden tension. He felt Isabella pull away and turned his head toward the sound of his father's footsteps. A brilliant, uninhibited smile spread across his face. "Dad!" he exclaimed, his voice ringing with a joy that was a dagger in Isabella's heart. "You're home early. Isabella showed me how to play the whole song. Isn't it beautiful?" Elias's eyes, chips of glacial blue that could dissect a balance sheet from 20 feet away, were fixed on Isabella. He saw her not as he usually did, a fleeting, anonymous figure in a grey uniform, part of the building's sterile machinery. But as a woman, her back ramrod straight, her chin held high in a posture of terrified defiance. He saw the calluses on her hands, the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and the tremor she was trying desperately to suppress. His gaze then shifted to his son. He saw Leo's radiant face, the pure, uncalculated happiness that he, with all his wealth and power, had never been able to conjure. He looked at the grand piano, a magnificent 7-figure instrument that had been little more than a piece of expensive furniture, now alive, now the source of a genuine life-altering connection. He saw the simple white blindfold, a barrier Leo used to calm his senses, and understood with a clarity that physically hurt that it was he, Elias, who had been truly blind. He had been blind to his son's loneliness, blind to the sterile emptiness of their life, and blind to the quiet miracle that had been unfolding right under his roof. An unfamiliar emotion, hot and heavy, coiled in his gut. It was shame. It was a profound, gut-wrenching shame, followed by a wave of gratitude so overwhelming it stole his breath. This woman, this cleaner he paid a negligible fraction of his income, had given his son something he never could. He, The man who owned the entire building suddenly felt like the poorest man in the room. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, stripped of its usual corporate precision. "Leo," he said, his eyes still locked on Isabella. It was beautiful. The next morning, the summons came as she knew it would. A crisp, impersonal email instructed her to report to Mr. Thorne's office on the 50th floor at 9 o'clock sharp. Isabella spent the night staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, the gentle sound of Sophia's breathing in the next room, a constant reminder of everything she stood to lose. She dressed in her cleanest uniform, a symbolic armor that felt pitifully thin. She walked into the corner office, a cathedral of glass and steel that offered a god's-eye view of Chicago, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was prepared for the sterile HR speak, the accusations, the cold finality of her dismissal. Elias was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out over the city he had conquered. He turned, and his expression was not one of anger or disappointment. It was one of weary introspection. "Please sit down, Ms. Ramirez," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs that faced his massive desk. She remained standing. Elias sighed, a sound of genuine frustration not with her but with himself. "Isabella," he said, her first name feeling strange and foreign coming from his lips. "I am not going to fire you." The words hung in the air, so contrary to her expectations that her mind struggled to process them. "Instead," he continued, walking around the desk to stand closer to her, creating an unnerving proximity, "I want to offer you a new position." He laid it out with a quiet, almost hesitant delivery. He wanted her to become Leo's full-time music instructor and companion. The salary he named was more than 4 times what she currently earned. It included full health benefits for her and Sophia, a dedicated pension plan, and, he added as if it were an afterthought, access to a personal studio space within the building should she wish to pursue her own music. Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't a dismissal, it was a rescue, and yet a deep, primal mistrust coiled within her. People like him didn't perform acts of charity without a price. She saw pity in his eyes, and it felt more insulting than anger. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper but firm. "Why would you do this?" Elias looked away, back toward the sprawling city below. He seemed to be searching for words that didn't come from a corporate playbook. "Because for the first time since my wife died, I saw my son truly happy last night," he said, his voice raw with a vulnerability that shocked her. "I've given him everything money can buy, the best therapists, the most expensive tutors, and all I managed to do was build him a more luxurious prison. I buried myself in this," he swept a hand toward the skyline, "to avoid the silence in my own home. I was a coward. You walked into that silence and filled it with music. You showed me how profound my neglect has been." His honesty was a disarming weapon. He wasn't the titan of industry she had imagined. He was a grieving man, a failing father, cloaked in a designer suit. Still, she hesitated. The chasm between their worlds felt too vast to be bridged by a job offer. "I'm a cleaner, Mr. Thorne," she said, the words a statement of fact, a reminder of the order of things. "I don't belong in your world." "My world has been dark for a very long time," he replied, meeting her gaze. "You brought light into it. Please help me keep it there." Word of Isabella's sudden, inexplicable promotion spread through the corporate floors of Thorne Enterprises like a virus. It began as whispers by the coffee machine, then morphed into speculative emails and snide remarks in executive washrooms. Ms. Evelyn Reed, the HR manager, whose entire career was built on rigid adherence to protocol, was incandescent with fury. She saw it as a flagrant breach of every rule, a personal affront to her authority. She, along with Isabella's former supervisor, Mr. Alvarez, and a handful of other executives who felt threatened by this disruption to the established hierarchy, launched a subtle but vicious campaign. They didn't attack Elias directly. They were too shrewd for that. Instead, they targeted Isabella. The narrative they spun was as predictable as it was poisonous. She was an opportunistic schemer, a manipulative woman who had used a vulnerable, disabled child to prey upon a wealthy, grieving widower. They questioned her credentials, her motives, her character. The rumors were designed to undermine Elias's judgment and create a scandal that would force him to reverse his decision. The pressure was immense. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of a shark who smelled blood in the water. Mr. Donovan Hayes, the notoriously ruthless chief executive officer of a rival tech firm, had a son who was also visually impaired. Having heard whispers of Leo's miraculous progress through the city's philanthropic circles, he saw an opening. He had one of his assistants discreetly track Isabella down and made her an offer that was, on paper, even more spectacular than Elias's. It was a blatant attempt to poach her, not because he cared about the music, but because stealing the source of Elias Thorne's miracle would be a delicious public humiliation, a corporate coup that would be talked about for years. The offer was a temptation, a lifeline out of the brewing storm at Thorne Enterprises. But when Isabella looked at the contract, all she could see was another gilded cage, another powerful man trying to purchase a piece of her soul. The campaign against her reached its peak during a quarterly board meeting. Ms. Reed, under the guise of a report on employee morale and corporate liability, presented a thinly veiled case against Isabella's appointment, citing risks to company image and potential legal exposure. It was a carefully orchestrated mutiny. Elias listened to it all, his face an unreadable mask of calm. When she had finished, a predatory silence fell over the boardroom. Elias stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power was in the quiet, absolute conviction in his tone. "Thank you for your concern, Evelyn," he began, the words laced with ice. "Let me be unequivocally clear. Ms. Ramirez's position is non-negotiable. Her value cannot be measured by a line on an org chart or a clause in a policy handbook. She possesses a talent and a compassion that has done more for my son in 2 months than this company's entire benefits package has done in 9 years. He paused, his eyes sweeping over every face at the table. "You speak of corporate image. Our image has for too long been one of relentless, sterile ambition. Perhaps it is time we project an image that includes humanity. That recognizes that true value is not always found on a spreadsheet." He looked directly at Ms. Reed. "If anyone here finds that concept difficult to embrace, my door is always open to accept your resignation." It was a declaration of war, and it was a stunning defense. He wasn't just defending an employee, he was defending a principle. He was defending her. That afternoon, Isabella found an envelope slid under her apartment door. It contained the signed contract for her new position and a simple handwritten note from Elias. It contained only 3 words. "The music awaits." Standing there in her hallway, holding the papers that represented a future she never dared to imagine, Isabella finally let herself believe. It was not an act of surrender, but an act of faith. With a steady hand, she signed her name, stepping out of the shadows and into an unknown but harmonious future. 6 months felt like a lifetime, or perhaps it was the beginning of one. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, a bastion of old Chicago elegance on the shores of Lake Michigan, was a universe away from the sterile, silent corridors of the Thorne Tower penthouse. Tonight, the air wasn't scented with industrial-grade polish and quiet desperation, but with the heady fragrance of lilies and the expensive perfume of the city's philanthropic elite. Crystal chandeliers, each one a constellation of captured light, dripped from the vaulted ceiling, casting a soft golden glow over the sea of tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns. The gentle clinking of champagne flutes and the low, confident murmur of 1,000 conversations formed a sophisticated symphony of their own. For Isabella Ramirez, standing just beyond the heavy velvet curtain of the main stage, the sound was a low hum beneath the frantic, triumphant drumming of her own heart. She smoothed down the front of her gown, a deep sapphire silk that felt alien and yet somehow right against her skin. It had been Elias's quiet insistence, arranged by a personal shopper who spoke in hushed, reverent tones. The calluses on her hands had softened over the past months, but she could still feel the phantom memory of a mop handle, of a heavy-duty spray bottle. They were a part of her, her testament to the journey that had brought her here. She looked down at her daughter, Sophia, who was perched on a plush chair in the front row, her small legs swinging with excitement, her eyes as wide as dinner plates. Sophia was wearing a velvet dress the color of a summer rose, her dark hair tied back with a matching ribbon. When she caught her mother's eye, she beamed, a pure, unadulterated wave of pride that washed over Isabella and settled every nerve in her body. This was real. This was happening. On stage, a podium stood bathed in a single, focused spotlight. Elias Thorne walked into it, and a polite, deferential applause rippled through the room. Isabella watched him on the monitor backstage. He was not the same man she had first seen in that sterile, imposing office. The hard, chiseled lines of his face seemed to have been softened by some internal warmth. The tension that had permanently resided in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a relaxed, grounded posture. He no longer looked like a CEO commanding a boardroom, but like a man who had finally found his center. He adjusted the microphone, and the room fell into a respectful silence. "Good evening," he began, his voice lacking the sharp, clipped cadence of his corporate persona. It was warmer, more resonant. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support the Children's Vision Foundation. For years, I've attended events like this. I've written checks, I've shaken hands, I've said all the right things. I thought I understood what it meant to give. I thought wealth and influence were the most powerful tools at my disposal to create change." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the affluent faces before him. "I was wrong." A quiet stir moved through the audience. Elias Thorne, a titan of industry known for his ruthless pragmatism, admitting he was wrong was an event in itself. "True change," he continued, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, "doesn't come from a ledger. It comes from connection. It comes from seeing the person right in front of you, truly seeing them. For a long time I was blind. I was so focused on building an empire, on managing outcomes, on seeing the big picture, that I failed to see the most important thing in my world, my own son." His gaze drifted to the wings of the stage, finding Isabella for a fleeting second. It was a look of profound, unvarnished gratitude. It was the look he had given her in his office 6 months ago, a look that had shattered her defenses and made her believe in the possibility of this new, impossible life. "My son Leo taught me how to see again," Elias said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "And he had a teacher, someone who saw past his limitations and heard the music he had locked inside him, someone who wasn't on my payroll, who wasn't a world-renowned specialist, but who had the two things he needed most: compassion and a shared passion. Tonight they are going to share a piece of that passion with all of you." He stepped back from the podium as the applause, now warmer and more genuine, filled the ballroom. The stage lights shifted, the single spotlight on the podium dimming as a soft, ethereal blue washed over the gleaming black expanse of a Fazioli grand piano at center stage. It was time. Isabella took a deep, steadying breath and held out her hand. A smaller hand, warm and confident, slipped into hers. Leo stood beside her, his posture straight, his head held high. He wore a small, perfectly tailored suit, and the ceremonial white blindfold he had once worn as a comfort was gone. He didn't need it anymore. He turned his face towards her, a radiant smile spreading across his lips. "Ready, Isa?" he whispered. "More than ready, Leo," she whispered back. She guided him onto the stage, their steps perfectly in sync. The applause swelled as they approached the piano. Isabella felt the hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, but they didn't matter. She wasn't the cleaner anymore. She wasn't the subject of corporate gossip. She was a musician, a teacher. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She settled onto the piano bench, Leo taking his place beside her, his small frame radiating a calm confidence that was a world away from the frustrated, isolated boy she had first met. His fingers found the keys with an easy familiarity. They had practiced this piece for weeks, not in the cavernous penthouse music room, but in the new studio Elias had built for her, a space filled with light and warmth and the freedom to create. They shared a silent nod, and then they began. The first notes fell into the hushed room like drops of silver rain. It was a piece of their own creation, a duet that started with a simple, melancholic melody reminiscent of Chopin, then slowly, intricately, began to weave in a more modern improvisational soul. It was the story of their journey. Isabella's part was the foundation, a rich, complex harmony filled with the echoes of loss and the quiet strength of resilience. Leo's part soared above it, a bright, clear melody full of youthful hope, intricate runs, and a breathtaking virtuosity that belied his age. Their hands moved across the 88 keys as if they were one being, a four-handed dance of perfect understanding. Isabella watched Leo as they played. His face was a portrait of pure, uninhibited joy. He was no longer just playing notes, he was speaking a language, painting with sound, his head tilted back as if he could feel the colors of the music washing over him. He didn't need to see the keys. He didn't need to see the audience. He could feel the music in his bones, in the very air around him. It was his world, and he was its master. The music swelled, rising to a powerful emotional crescendo. In the front row, Sophia sat utterly mesmerized, her hands clasped under her chin, watching her mother transform into a queen before her very eyes. She saw the strength in her mother's posture, the grace in her hands, the passion on her face. This was her mum. This magnificent, powerful woman was her mum. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of an overwhelming, heart-bursting pride. Across the ballroom, hardened executives and society doyens, people who navigated the world with a shield of cynical detachment, found themselves captivated. The raw, honest emotion pouring from the stage bypassed their defenses. They saw not a charity case or a corporate curiosity, but a profound human connection expressed through the universal language of music. Handkerchiefs were discreetly dabbed at eyes. Husbands reached for their wives' hands. For a few breathtaking minutes, the pretense of the gala melted away, leaving only the shared, vulnerable heart of the human experience. As the final, lingering note hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering moment of silence descended upon the room. It was a sacred quiet, a collective breath held in awe. Then the silence shattered. The ballroom erupted. The applause wasn't polite. It was a roar, a standing ovation that thundered with genuine, heartfelt admiration. Leo, beaming, squeezed Isabella's hand. She looked at him, her own vision blurred with tears. San saw not the son of a billionaire CEO, but the boy who had reawakened her soul. They stood and took a bow, a unit of perfect harmony. As they turned to leave the stage, Elias met them, his own eyes shining. He didn't say a word. He simply wrapped one arm around Leo and the other around Isabella, pulling them into a brief, powerful embrace before leading them back to the podium. The applause slowly subsided as Elias raised a hand. "What you just heard," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "is the reason we are all here tonight. It is proof that talent, passion, and the human spirit are not confined by circumstance. They are everywhere, in every neighborhood, in every child, often waiting for just one person to help them find the key." He cleared his throat, his composure regained. That is why, effective tonight, Thorn Industries is launching a new initiative. It is called the Harmony Project. A new wave of murmurs swept the room. "We are seeding this project with an initial endowment of $20 million. The murmurs turned to gasps. "To create and fund comprehensive music and arts education programs in underprivileged public schools and community centers across Chicago, with a special focus on children with disabilities." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "For too long we have defined innovation in terms of technology and profit margins. It's time we redefine it. True innovation is nurturing the human soul. It's investing in empathy, in creativity, in connection." He then turned and looked directly at Isabella, his voice softening once more. "This entire project was inspired by one person, a woman of extraordinary talent, immense compassion and unwavering integrity, who reminded a blind old fool what it truly means to see. Thank you, Isabella Ramirez." He led the applause for her, and the room joined in. A resounding acknowledgement not of a maid who got lucky, but of a hero who had changed lives. Later, as the last of the guests departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of lilies and the echo of music, the four of them stood near the grand windows overlooking the glittering necklace of lights along Lakeshore Drive. The night was quiet now. Sophia, sleepy but still buzzing with excitement, leaned against Isabella's side. Leo stood close to Elias, recounting every note of their performance with a breathless energy. Elias caught Isabella's eye over the heads of their children. There was no pretense between them, no lingering awkwardness of their employer-employee relationship. They were partners, a new kind of family, forged not by blood or romance, but by the crucible of shared experience, by a deep, abiding respect, and by the love they both held for the children who had brought them together. The future was unwritten, a blank sheet of music waiting for its first notes. But for the first time in a very long time it shimmered with the promise of a beautiful, harmonious composition. Sometimes, a life can feel like a locked room, a place of silence and forgotten dreams. We convince ourselves that the doors are sealed, that the key has been lost forever. But the story of Isabella, Leo, and Elias is a powerful reminder that the key is almost never what we think it is. It isn't always found in wealth or status, but in the quiet courage of a single, unexpected act of kindness. It's in the person who chooses to see past a uniform, to hear past a disability, and to connect with the human soul hiding just beneath the surface. Their journey shows us that the most profound harmonies are often created when two completely different worlds collide, creating a music more beautiful than either could have ever made alone. It's a testament to the fact that within every one of us, there is a song waiting to be played, and sometimes all we need is someone to sit beside us and gently guide our hands. The world is full of these quiet heroes and unheard melodies. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of human connection, please consider leaving a like to help it reach others who might need to hear it. Share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to be part of a community that celebrates the stories that reveal the very best of who we can be. Because in the end, it's these notes of compassion and understanding that compose the most beautiful symphony of all, the one that gives us all a little more hope.